Alright, well, this is another chapter in our continuing adventures of the Kid and the Glinton Gang. This one I'm going to start on chapter 12, and hopefully I can move to chapter 13 with this video. There's a lot of material to cover in this particular section, maybe not this particular chapter, but then leading into the next chapters as well, depending on how much I can squeeze in. So far we've been following along as the gang has caused some chaos. We've met pretty much everybody so far, at least as far as who we're going to be with for a little while. So I'm just going to go straight into the plot points. By now you should have a pretty good idea of who these people are, and the fact that following the kid like we did originally is not necessarily going to tell the whole story. We kind of go in and out of all of the characters' psyches, depending on sort of what the narrator decides they're going to do, and depending on what the author, what perspective. We have some interesting shifts of perspective in this chapter that I'll go over as well. Okay, so we have slaughter of the Indian village near the beginning of chapter 12, and this is lead up. This is what I've been leading up to when I've suggested that there was some moments of violence that may be pretty graphic. I think I warned you a little bit about that, but not a warning as in, I expect you to respond one way or the other. Just in the sense that, yes, there is a sort of a graphic nature to the violence. And I personally think that it's okay for anybody to respond in whatever fashion they can. If you need to just cast your eyes over those parts and then just sort of move on and just understand kind of what's going on, I perfectly understand that. But one of the things to note about this kind of thing is that we have to ask ourselves that question continuously, is that in this book, in particular, is that kind of violence that gets described sensationalistic, meaning is it just sort of being done for effect, just sort of to shock us, or is it really doing something else? And I tend to go with the doing something else. Cormac McCarthy in this book has been criticized, probably rightfully so in some cases, that he tends to go overboard with the violence, and that is a valid criticism. I think that criticism would be a little bit more in the minority now that we sort of understand a little bit more of what the intention was in terms of getting the history out of the way. What I mean by that is that remember that the idea of a narrative that you can control is that it's easy and neat and tells a really simple story, right? That has a certain power. When that's the only narrative that's being allowed. So for example, we have the good guys and the bad guys, right? So if the good guys are writing the story and they portray themselves as purely good guys, and then they write the bad guys as just simply bad guys, that's a very simple story to grasp, and we can work with that. One of the things about history in this sort of postmodern age is that things don't necessarily work out exactly like that, right? Sometimes it gets a little bit more complicated, right? People that we may perceive as being the good guys did have some sort of elements to the history that maybe weren't so good, right? And maybe we find out things that complicate that idea. And so that's kind of what I'm going with, is that when we look at the truth of history, it's a very violent, bloody thing sometimes, right? And so to look away from that does not necessarily cast an honest eye on what actually happened. So in this case, he's using the book, which is fiction, but he's putting some truth in there, quote unquote, right? The graphic nature of it. In other words, we can't turn away from this just because it's graphic, because then we sort of do the job of that easy history that maybe that is easier to teach, right? So I hope that makes sense in the context of what's going on here. But that's really a question that you have to ask yourself: is that is the truth more important than just thinking that this is a sensationalistic thing? Okay, so the slaughter of the Indian village is one of those places where things get pretty graphic. But as a follow-up, as far as the plot points go, after that, near the end of the slaughter, basically, we have this debate about whether Gomez, this particular native was Gomez or not Gomez, who's apparently a half-breed, quote-unquote half-breed, that they've been chasing. So we suddenly find out that maybe there's some bounties that they're looking for. Certainly, as we've followed around these characters, we haven't seen them as sort of purposeful in a lot of ways, right? Their purpose seems to be to get money, but now we kind of, we seem to have a justification for all of these, this violence and this sort of meandering around. And I don't know, maybe the justification, maybe it's just me, but I think it seems like they're putting that justification after the fact. They seem to enjoy this just a little bit too much for it to be just a job, in other words, if you know what I'm getting at. But that being said, Gomez is a very valuable prize. He's apparently an outlaw that the authorities are chasing that they can turn in for money. So that's where that discussion is from. Is that they're trying to figure out, can they pass this off as Gomez or not, right? And my guess is that there have been a lot of Gomez's turned in for a lot of rewards, and he's just sort of this legendary figure that they say, hey, look, we got him. It looks like him, right? And then they get money for it. I'm guessing that they're not the only ones that have done this. So just by their discussion, but they kind of say, okay, well, this is good enough, kind of thing. After that, there's an Apache boy that's taken hostage and then killed. I'll go over that in just a second, but that is kind of a sad moment, and a graphic moment, and maybe even a shocking moment when we find out that the judge has been sort of treating this kid. He sort of seems to adopt him for a while, and then he kills him, and it's sort of this heartless moment. That I'll go over in just a second. And I'm going to use that mainly as a scene that we can look at maybe a little bit more carefully in terms of what the narrator is trying to do, in terms of the sympathies, in terms of the justifications, and then in terms of the point of view. There's a lot of things going on there. But one thing to note as I go into the notes section rather than just the plot is that this Indian encounter, quote-unquote encounter, this slaughter, is really the first one we see up close, right? Other times we see sort of after effects. I don't know if you noticed that, but most of the violence has been sort of after the fact. It's been described in sort of after the wagon train gets slaughtered, or after they get dragged away, and then some little moments of action. But really, the graphic nature of this scene sort of throws it in our face a little bit more than it did before. So that might be something to make note of if you do want to use the graphic violence sort of a representation of something else. This chapter does have that encounter in full. The second point that I want to make from this chapter is that there's a really odd moment. I don't know if you noticed this, but there's an odd moment where the Apache boy, there's a shift in point of view, in perspective, and the Apache boy gets called an it. Let me read that off because it's kind of hard to explain. And I'm on my page 170. On the third night, they crouched in the keep of the old walls of slump mud, and the fires of the enemy not a mile distant on the desert. The judge sat with the Apache boy before the fire, and it watched everything with dark, very eyes, and some of the men played with it and made it laugh, and they gave it jerky, and it sat chewing and watched gravely the figures that passed above it. They recovered it with a blanket, and in the morning the judge was dandling it on one knee while the men saddled their horses. Okay, and then after this, Judge Holden, he seems to be sort of the Indian boy seems to be sort of a mascot in a way. And when the judge kills him, Glanton says, God damn you, why'd you do that? And then he pulls out a gun and says, why'd you do it? And then Holden says, well, either shoot me or put it away. And so eventually Glanton puts it away. But there's something about this particular scene and this particular interaction. I mean, they've killed a lot of people, and I'm presuming a lot of children and a lot of women. They don't seem to have much moral fiber. But this seems to be a moment where Glanton kind of says, okay, you took this a little bit too far. And maybe one of the clues is sort of how the narrator shifts that perspective. So what do we do with all of this? It's kind of a stew that's mixing up, right? So we have essentially this scene that where the moral fiber of Glanton is tested, even though we didn't think he really had much moral fiber, because of what the Apache boy represented. We have the narrator kind of coming in and interrupting things and saying, I'm going to shift the point of view so that the Apache boy is being called an it as opposed to a he or a she, right? It's sort of a purposeful thing. It sort of draws us out of the scene for a moment. And so all of those things are going on. And, as for what to do with it, I can probably leave that up to you a little bit. But at least from my perspective, it seems to be a commentary that's being made on sort of the distance that's created, right? We see this Indian slaughter, really, maybe it's very visceral, meaning it's sort of gut level. It kind of hits us in the gut a little bit. And then here, right when there's this really emotional moment where the gang seems to be attached, the narrator pulls us back, right? and sort of turns the Apache boy into this object, right? And so I think one of the things that may be going on is that it is playing with sort of that moment where, violence and emotion and point of view being close and distant, all kind of mixed together in a sort of strange way. And sometimes this book will do that. The narrator, whoever he or it is sort of this godlike perspective that kind of comes into the story a little bit. And there were a few moments, and I may point some of them out in some of the other videos, but I think this is one of those moments where that narrator kind of comes in and plucks the reader out of it and kind of shows him some things, kind of reveals the tricks behind the screen. So I'm hoping that kind of made sense to you. So that's the best that I can do for now. There's a lot of things going on in Chapter 12, at least in terms of symbolic terms. In terms of the actual action, remember, it's just that first slide where I just showed you, okay, they slaughter the Indian village, they argue about Gomez, not Gomez. The kid removes an arrow, which is also another point that's interesting, where the moral function of the character is kind of weird because when the kid pulls, he seems to be like helping his companion, right? If you recall that scene. And this is another moment where that moral sort of confusion occurs, because even though he seems to be helping his companion, nobody else wants to really help this guy. And even the guy that's like that's got the arrow is like, he doesn't seem very appreciative of it. And even when the kid does it, he seems to do the right thing by helping him pull out the arrow. And everybody else gets kind of pissed at him, saying, okay, why'd you do that, man? He was going to die. Now he's going to live, and now, he's, for whatever reason. Maybe there's selfish purposes there. Maybe he's going to take part of the share of the reward. But I think it's more than that. I think they all kind of, assume that people should be left to their fates. And that's kind of something interesting that goes on in that particular scene where whenever somebody does the right thing, quote unquote, or at least the moral thing, everybody doesn't seem to take it as sort of a good thing. Maybe not always a bad thing, but not really a good thing. Just like, why'd you do that? That was pointless. He's probably going to die anyway, and he's limping along. And if he just died, you just get it out of the way, right? So anyway, you might want to read that scene a little bit closely too. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time on Chapter 12 to make sure that you understood that even though there's a sort of a ABC kind of thing that you can look at, you can actually start connecting some of these different scenes. Excuse me, and trying to figure out kind of how they can work together. Okay, so in the following videos, I will continue on with Chapter 13, and since I have some pretty extensive notes on 13 through whenever I finish up, then I'll break this up as best I can. Okay, so this so far has been Chapter 12. Thank you.